Good evening, everyone. I'd like to say a huge thanks to you all for coming along to this community event in Lasswade High tonight. It's great to see so many of you here. I'd also like to say a huge thanks to our fantastic speakers for coming along and sharing their expertise and knowledge with us. Colin, Beattie, SNP, MSP, Janet Moxley, Scottish Greens, and Professor Andrew Watterson, University of Stirling. Also our chair for the evening, Eurig, Scandrett, Friends of the Earth. Unfortunately, Professor John Robertson is unable to attend due to illness tonight. I'd just like to add a few words on why we're here before I hand over to Eurig. I assume that you will all know a bit about fracking by now, with the subject being covered in the papers and on the TV more in the past few weeks than in previous months and years. However, are we being told the full facts? It is not until you start doing research of your own and investigating under the surface that you start to uncover a lot more than you bargained for. As I've looked into fracking, underground coal gasification, try that again, underground coal gasification, UCG, and coal bed methane, CBM, you realise that you have to start making a noise and doing something about it. We cannot simply let these companies and this industry march into our countryside and under our Firth Of Forth. During this event, you will hear arguments and findings why we need to make our voices heard loud and clear in the upcoming public consultations as part of the evidence being gathered in the moratorium announced by our Energy Minister, Fergus Ewing, last month. We owe it to our children and subsequent generations to fight these oil and gas companies with everything we have, or they will have a very different Scotland. Our kids will be living in a gas field in the central belt of Scotland. I hope that you leave here tonight informed, educated, and most importantly motivated. Recently, over 30 groups across the central belt of Scotland wrote a letter to Fergus Ewing under the umbrella which is the Broad Alliance. We need this message to get out to the whole of the general public and swell the numbers in the Broad Alliance, and these community events can do that. We need everyone to care enough about our land to stand up to the greedy oil and gas companies. If after tonight you feel like you'd like to join a group, there's a Facebook group called Midlothian Against Fracking, and there will soon be one in Musselburgh. Please feel free to fill in the forms on the information table as you leave later on. And I'm going to hand over to our chair, Eurig. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. My name's Eurig Scandrett. I'm chair of Friends of the Earth Scotland. Just a brief introduction before we put on the film. I'm delighted to see so many people here. This is an issue that is raising a lot of concern. Last August, a few community groups in areas that were directly affected by unconventional gas extraction asked Friends of the Earth if we could help get an alliance of communities together to try and lobby and to try and prevent the unconventional gas extraction that was going on. Initially there were 3 or 4 communities last August. Very quickly it became 10, 20, and there's now over 30 community groups around Scotland that have mobilised just in the past 6 months or so around fracking and unconventional gas. This is a real community-led campaign. We had a significant victory a couple of weeks ago when Fergus Ewing announced a moratorium on some aspects of unconventional gas extraction. It wasn't a full victory, but it did show what the power of community lobbying campaigning can do. So I think it's really important to see people here taking a stand against unconventional gas. Before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to ask a short film be shown. Can you press the appropriate button?
Let's talk about fracking. I don't know, I'm not smart enough to understand it. Here's what I know about fracking. The greedy oil and gas companies of this country have decided that they can squeeze every last little ounce of oil and gas out of previously pumped wells by injecting the substrata of our planet with highly toxic, carcinogenic chemicals, which then seep into the aquifer and hence inroads into the water supply of Americans. The Delaware water gap has been ruined. The Hudson Valley has been ruined. Most of Pennsylvania has been ruined. Virginia, West Virginia has been ruined. Colorado has been ruined. New Mexico has been ruined. They're poisoning our drinking water, and the EPA said, you know what? You no longer have to comply with EPA standards for stuff you put into the water. So the greedy oil and gas company said, great, let's go crazy. And then some states are saying, no, we have a transparency law. So the oil and gas companies say, okay, we'll tell you everything but 2% of what we're putting into your tap water. And that's supposed to make us feel better. Ladies and gentlemen, we're screwed. I've seen people set fire to their tap water.
Yes,
Can I get you a nice, you want some ice water? Kaboom! I've seen people set fire to their toilets.
Hydraulic fracturing is an inherently contaminating industrial process that injects millions of gallons of water laced with toxic chemicals at enormous pressure to break apart rock and release gas from underground formations. Watersheds across the nation have been contaminated with plastics, carcinogens, neurotoxins, and endocrine-disrupting chemicals, and with explosive natural gas. Their investigation uncovered thousands of internal documents showing that radioactive wastewater and harmful carcinogens such as benzene were being inadequately treated and put back into drinking water supplies all over Pennsylvania. Number 1, from Southwestern Energy, the diagram clearly shows that the gas well has a cement barrier around the sides of it that prevents gas from lower layers migrating upwards into aquifers. This isn't a PowerPoint about drilling wells. This is a PowerPoint about how casings fail and allow gas and other substances to migrate into aquifers. It's one of their own documents about how cement fails. Number 2 comes from Scandrett, oil field review published in 2003 that showed that sustained casing pressure, i.e. casing failure, occurs at alarming rates. Their own documents showed that well casings failed in 6% of wells drilled immediately upon drilling, and that those well casings deteriorated over time, that over a 30-year period, 50% of well casings failed. Number 3, this report shows gas migration at astronomical rates in deviated or horizontal wells. Number 4, surface casing, the casing around groundwater, doesn't help the problem at all. Number 5, this report, leaked out of a gas industry conference from Archer, a well services company, shows enormous rates of leakage in the Gulf of Mexico and the North Sea, and high rates of what they call uncontrolled discharge. Recent Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection statistics back up Scandrett's initial findings. Well leakage was between 6.2 and 7.2% for newly installed wells, gas migrating into aquifers. So does anybody want to guess how long a gas well has to last? Not to produce gas, but to do its other function of protecting the groundwater from underground sources of chemicals and gas that could migrate. I'll give you a hint. It begins with an F, forever. These well casings and these gas wells have to last forever, or else they pose an immediate and constant risk to groundwater.
As a whole, this community naively felt that this area is so special and so important as an agricultural resource. There's no way in the world that they'll ever be mining here. They're like, it's just stupid.
The first easement they wanted to put through our place was diagonally past the front of our house. And they only tell you the good part about it until they start, and then you find out that there's pipelines going north, south, east and west, and wherever they feel fit to go.
The representatives of the gas companies, you know when they're lying because their lips are moving. It is all about getting their company onto your property to extract a resource, often at your property's detriment.
Unconventional forms of gas, such as coal seam gas, shale gas and type gas, differ from natural gas because they're more difficult to extract and can't be developed with conventional processes. Unconventional gas production is highly invasive above and below ground, requiring massive numbers of wells and intrusive extraction methods such as horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, or fracking.
This industrialises your region. Your whole region turns into a factory, a gas factory.
Not an industry that has a light environmental footprint, despite all the lies their spin doctors go on with and the massive advertising campaigns that they've engaged in, saying that they're clean and green. They're not.
This is my land. It's also one of Australia's biggest coal seam gas reserves. Santos are currently running ads designed to induce, in those who see them, a sense of feeling that this is all pretty mundane, straightforward, very safe. Well, they don't tell you what the ads should tell us. They're frightened to show us a map of the gas wells and what they look like. They're frightened to show us a map of the all-weather roads that we needed to service the gas wells. They're frightened to show us a map of the topsoil, which will need to be removed for pipe construction to connect the gas wells. They're frightened to tell us that these coal seam gas initiatives will become large industrial estates. They don't tell us any of this. They will require many, many hectares. Santos don't tell us how many compressors they will need. They don't tell us what they'll do with the gas or the water. They don't tell us once the water is treated where you'll store it, because the volumes will be greater than several Sydney harbours. They don't tell us where they'll put the residue. They don't tell us where the salt will go or what it will do to the soil. They don't tell us that it's a 24/7 operation. In other words, they don't tell us what a fully blown gas field looks like.
Let's talk about fracking. I don't know, I'm not smart enough to understand it. Here's what I know about fracking.
Okay, thanks very much for putting those films together. Now we're going to move on to the speakers. First, Janet Moxley is going to speak. Janet's an environmental scientist. She previously has worked for SEPA, Scottish Environment Protection Agency, so she knows a little bit about what it's like to try and police polluting industries, I'm sure. But I'm going to ask Janet to come up. Steps are down.
I think I might just take this microphone out and just come down the front so that I can see the slides I'm talking about, because I think it's more important you see the slides than you see me. So if this will come out. Yeah.
Use the wireless mic. It's just in front of Faye there. Click the orange button at the bottom. There you go.
Oh, yes? Yeah, great, okay. So I was just going to start off by kind of elaborating a bit. It's partly covered in the film about what unconventional gas is.
Up on the stage.
Well, I prefer not to be on the stage because then I can't see what I'm talking about as well. So, conventional gas builds up as a fairly large reservoir, as it was shown on that last film, where there's a undulation in the rock and the gas bubbles up through a fairly porous layer and gets caught underneath an impermeable layer that it can't get through. So the reservoirs are pretty large, and when, say in the North Sea, they drill for gas, they drill down, hit one of these large reservoirs and extract the gas from it. We're getting to the stage now where these fairly easy to access gas supplies aren't available anymore, and the oil companies and gas companies are looking for other ways to extract gas. So they're looking at smaller and smaller pockets of gas, and they've become particularly interested in gas that's trapped in shale So like in West Lothian, where you've got the old shale bings, where there's been oil shale, in between the shale and which has the oil in it, there are little pockets of gas. Or in coal beds, where there are pockets of methane trapped in the coal. And when the people were deep mining, that was periodically what would escape and could cause underground fires when that gas escaped. It doesn't make sense for the companies to drill individually over each of these small pockets. And so they've developed a technology where they can drill down and drill sideways to connect up these pockets of gas. So you have the two technologies, which I'm going to speak about first, which is shale gas and coal gasification, are fairly similar. I'll talk in a minute about another technology. So shale gas and coal bed methane are fairly similar. I'll talk in a minute about coal gasification, which is rather different. So the coal bed methane and shale gas involve drilling down and drilling sideways, essentially to connect up pockets of gas. Initially, this might not involve fracking. So fracking has become a bit of a shorthand for unconventional gas extraction, but it doesn't cover all aspects of it. Once they've drilled down and started to drill sideways, for shale gas, they can release the gas pretty much straight away. Coal bed methane, what they have to do is dewater the coal. So the initial stage is drilling down, starting to drill sideways and starting to pump large volumes of water out of the coal. So immediately with coal bed methane, they're creating large volumes of wastewater because they have to get the water out before they can connect the gas pockets. They can drill sideways for several hundred metres, but after a point, what tends to happen, what's happened in most sites where this has been done elsewhere in the world, is that the supply starts to run low, and they decide that they need to try and connect to other pockets of gas, which is where fracking starts to come in. This involves injecting high pressure fluid back down the wells to try and push the rocks apart, to crack the rocks and join up extra pockets of gas to the supplies that they've managed to access so far. So as well, the fracking fluid is mainly water, and the companies like to play up, well, it's only water we're putting down. It's a mixture of water, sand to hold the cracks open to let the gas through, and various other chemicals to help the process. So it contains surfactants, it contains lubricants to help the water flow through, it contains antibacterial agents to stop slime forming in the water that's down there, and various other additives, anti-corrosives to try and stop the pipes that's going down corroding and things. So it's not pure water. The additives are there at quite low levels, but because there are large volumes of water pumped down, overall quite large volumes of these additives are injected into the drilling well, and so they build up. They then come back out, and the fluid can then also be contaminated with materials which are occurring in the coal, things like benzene, toluene, xylene, ethyl benzene, carcinogenic materials which they mentioned in the film, potentially radioactive gases like radon and radium, which build up in deep rock formations. And these are things that are very difficult to get out of the wastewater. So this is a sort of picture of shale gas drilling down, drilling sideways. Is my slide mover onto? No. Is it just on the screen? Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks. Coal bed methane, so similar, has to dewater first and then extract gas and then potentially frack after that. And the final technology that, the next one as well, is something that's a bit different, called underground coal gasification. Underground coal gasification is, in a way, a more extreme way of getting gas. It involves partially combusting a thin coal seam underground. So what happens is that mixture of superheated steam and air are sent down the well, heats up the coal, it partially burns, smoulders to create a mixture of carbon monoxide, methane and steam, which is rather like the old Towns gas. People might remember, or people my age and older might remember the old gas works that used to be somewhat smelly. Living bigger, and I've got the old gas works just behind my house, so I can still smell it 30 years after it's shut. It smoulders, and then the gas is brought back up. So the gas that comes from underground coal gasification wouldn't be the sort of gas that everyone can burn in their houses, because everybody was converted back in the 70s to run on North Sea gas, which is essentially methane. There was a process then that everybody had to get all their appliances switched over. So this could only be used by industrial users. It wouldn't benefit anybody in terms of being accessible or reducing fuel bills or anything of that sort, because it's a different mixture of gases. This hasn't really been tried commercially in any wide-scale sort of way. There's, at the moment, underground coal gasification. There are 2 pilot plants in Australia, one of which has been closed down for breaches of environmental regulation, and one in Kazakhstan, which I'm not sure what the environmental regulations or health regulations are like in Kazakhstan, but I suspect that they're rather more relaxed than they would be anywhere in Europe. So Scotland would be a bit of a guinea pig for this technology. In terms of trying it out and seeing what happens. So, next slide. That's it. So this is just looking at where this could happen. In Scotland, there have already been some licences issued for coal bed methane extraction, or have been applied for coal bed methane extraction. Either test drilling has occurred in a number of locations. There's been one borehole near Cumbernauld, a series of test boreholes near Airth along the Forth, and Canonbie boreholes have been approved by the planning authorities, at least for commercial coal bed methane extraction in a rather peculiar process where the council considered 19 boreholes, a compressor station and a flare stack as being each individual minor applications under the planning system, and so they were waved through by a planning official without going to the council and without anyone really knowing what was going on down there. The community have tried to appeal that this shouldn't have been a minor development. Dumfries and Galloway Council saying that they think that it should be minor developments, all 19 of them, and I think there's still potential for that going to a judicial review, but obviously that costs money, and not all communities have the money to do that. At Airth, there's been an application for commercial extraction along the Forth that was made jointly to Falkirk and Stirling councils. Both councils decided they hadn't got the expertise to determine the application, unlike Dumfries and Galloway, where an official thought he was perfectly well qualified to do this. But yeah, rather more sensibly, Stirling and Falkirk decided that this was a new technology. Their staff didn't understand it enough to be able to determine the application, and so it's been referred back to Scottish Government, where it has remained for the best part of a year. I think they were supposed to be reporting back on a decision in February, and that's now got overtaken by Scottish Government's moratorium on coal bed methane and shale gas extraction. There's also the black splodges on there, which are sites where licences have... So the red sites on there are where licences have been granted. The orange sites are where licences have been offered by the UK government, and there's been a bidding process for those sites. They won't necessarily all be licensed because some are more favourable probably in terms of geology than others. UK government haven't announced where or whether they've granted any of those licences, although Jim Ratcliffe, who owns the Grangemouth refinery, has publicly said that he's bid for licences near to Falkirk, and I think fully expects to get them. That's all got slightly, again, overtaken by the Smith Commission and the proposal to devolve onshore gas licensing to the Scottish Parliament, and I think there's a strong feeling that it would be against the spirit of the Smith Commission if licences were granted before those powers were devolved, but that's no guarantee that it won't happen. So we're still waiting to hear from that. The black splodges are sites for this underground coal gasification. They're mainly along the shore rather than inland, so they wouldn't be covered by proposals to devolve onshore gas extraction. So there's sites along the Forth where Clough Energy and others have applied for permission for underground coal gasification, and sites along the Solway where Five Quarters Energy, who are part owned by Buccleuch Estates, who also own the land at Canonby, where the coal bed methane application went through, are keen to, as they see, develop this wonderful opportunity. So those are the areas in Scotland, and you know, obviously that's right across the central belt, because a lot of the communities in Scotland have grown up in areas because of historically, because of coal mining being the local industry. So basically, the most populated areas in Scotland, the areas where there are mining communities, former mining communities, are the sort of areas where there is likely to be interest from the gas extraction companies. Okay, next one. Yeah, that was just a bit more close up on the area affected by the coal gasification along the Forth. So yeah, I wanted just then to talk a little bit about the risks of some of these technologies, because there are differences between the technologies as to potential risks. All of them, you know, in a way, one of my main objections to this is all of them continue our reliance on fossil fuels, and they continue to emit carbon dioxide, and, which is a greenhouse gas, and there's a risk of leaks of methane, which is a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, 25 times more powerful. So yeah, that is a real risk. So carbon dioxide from burning the fuels, methane, as we saw in the film there, can leak from pipelines, particularly, well, there's proven evidence that it can leak from pipelines with shale gas extraction and coal bed methane extraction. Depending on who you listen to, the failure rate of wells is somewhere between 2% and 64%. Any of it is unacceptable. NASA found in the US recently there was a massive methane cloud across parts of America where there are onshore gas wells. So that's a real cause for concern. There's the greenhouse gas aspect of it. Also, with well failures, as we saw in the film, in some cases in America, there've been leakage of methane back up the concrete casings around wells where it's got into groundwater. We've been told the geology is different here. We've been told it could be regulated here. SEPA have no experience of regulating this. The well construction would actually be regulated by the Health and Safety Executive rather than SEPA. That SEPA would have to sort of talk. SEPA are responsible for protecting groundwater, but the regulation around groundwater protection is not really designed for dealing with this sort of threat. It's designed for dealing with things being dropped into it from the top rather than bubbling up from underneath. Yeah, so there's that. The air pollution side, as well as methane and carbon dioxide leaks, series of sites have to have flare stacks to release any sudden surges of pressure that build up. If they suddenly hit a pocket of gas that's got more pressure in it than they expected and they can't get it down the pipe to an end user, then it has to flare. So you know, flares like the Grangemouth flare can then generate polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are carcinogenic, and particulates, also carcinogenic, and nitrous oxide and other respiratory irritants. So that's, you know, plus things like traffic coming on and off site. Water pollution was mentioned from. So air pollution again is potentially a risk from all of the technologies there, because there's potential for contamination coming back up well shafts. Particularly, there's evidence to say of this for coal bed methane and shale gas production. Water pollution Again, it's mainly from things coming back up well shafts. I think the film was talking about well shaft failures in the North Sea. Well, the North Sea is a simpler geology to drill into. It's a more understood geology. It's got the dome. It's not got horizontal drilling involved in it, and it's not in areas like central Scotland where there are large numbers of faults in the rock, which mean that the wells have to bend to a certain extent rather than going straight down. Also, if you do need to frack, then fracking in itself the process of splitting the rock apart causes shakes and bumps and minor earthquakes, and that puts additional stresses on the well casings. And if the well casing does fail, the place where it's most likely to fail is the place where it's wet, and that's going to be where it meets the aquifer underground. So that is, if it's going to rust, that's where it's going to go. The risk of seismic activity is probably highest for shale gas and coal bed methane, because they're the technologies that involve fracking. Coal gasification, because it's a different technology, because it's using a large coal seam, it's not joining up small pockets of gas, doesn't need to be fracked. So I think this is partly where the companies have taken advantage of people using fracking as a shorthand, and they'll sort of say, well, we're not this isn't a technology that involves fracking, so there's nothing to worry about. What happens when the coal bed burns away, and if and when it collapses and how much it stays up? There haven't really been enough sites overseas to know what's going on and what that does at the surface. Then there's the other sort of usual, to some extent, planning implications, traffic on and off site during construction, but also during operation of these sites. And the landscape effects, because it's not a case of drilling one well and leaving it. What happens is they drill one well, it runs dry after a few months, they have to drill another and another and another, and I think the estimate is there would be thousands of wells. If coal bed methane and shale gas extraction goes ahead in Scotland, there would be thousands of wells across the central belt, and probably more than the 19 that have already been applied for at Canonby. So it rolls across the landscape. The wells have to be joined up by pipe work, by tracks. There's drilling rigs, flare stacks. It's not a pretty sight, and it doesn't make access to the landscape or to the land for recreation or any other purposes particularly good. So these are the sort of visual effects. If you imagine looking down from the Pentlands at this area, if this area was to be affected, it would cover a lot of the area. It would have a big effect. Underground fires, a potential risk from coal gasification. We're told that the process can be controlled because it relies on air and steam being injected into the ground, and they can switch off the air. That removes the oxygen, it will stop. That's probably true up to a certain extent, but if, as has happened, say, with some of the, elsewhere with coal bed methane and shale gas, if the system connects up to a mine shaft that people don't know are there, then that gives an additional way for oxygen to come in. We know that, although the coal authorities mapped more recent mines in Scotland, there are old mine shafts in a lot of places that aren't well documented. So that would mean that even if the oxygen supply was switched off at the top, there may be other ways for oxygen to get into the system. So, I think because it's a not proven technology, there's no one really with experience of dealing with this if it did become out of control underground. So, those are the risks. So. Plus the health risks, which Andrew will talk about in more detail. So looking at regulation, what can we do about it? Well, the first stage of regulation is that operators have to get what's called a PEDAL licence. That's a Petroleum Exploration and Development licence, which currently comes from the UK government. That covers the onshore coal bed methane and shale gas extraction. The offshore, the coal gasification is licensed slightly differently through the Coal Authority, I believe. I'm not quite so up to speed on how that is licensed. But so the first stage is to get, the operator has to get a license to be able to do any drilling or exploration or exploit the gas. So yeah, UK government gets some money from that, they're quite pleased about that. If it was devolved to Scotland, Scottish government would get some money, and Fergus Ewing at times has sounded like he would be quite pleased about that as well. So yeah, there could be a motivation for Scottish government to decide that they would like that money. Next stage is that there has to be planning permission which covers really what's going on the surface and the infrastructure on the surface. That's made through the planning authorities. As I say, two of the planning authorities, Stirling and Falkirk, feel they haven't got the expertise to deal with this. So Dumfries and Galloway have gone their own pretty way on that one. The planning system works that the planning authorities can only work within a framework that's set up by Scottish Government. So there is things that Scottish Government can do within the planning framework to either make it easier or harder for companies to operate. So in Australia, there's a 2-kilometre buffer zone around sites that have just been put there for health reasons. So sites have to be 2 kilometres away from any settlement. The Scottish Government have said there will be buffer zones around sites if this was implemented, but they haven't set a hard and fast limit. They've said that the companies applying for planning permission will do a risk assessment, and it will be up to the local authorities to decide whether they've made a fair and reasonable risk assessment. As I said, the local authorities at the moment think they haven't got the expertise to be able to deal with this sort of thing. So we've seen with open cast sites where there have been buffer zones around open cast sites, there have been houses 20 metres from the edge of open cast voids. This discretionary element isn't particularly sensible or fair. It leads to the people who make least fuss being left nearer to things than people that are more empowered and make more of a case. So I think if everybody's health is going to be valued equally, there should be a mandatory limit, and if 2 kilometres is good enough for Australia, 2 kilometres should be good enough for Scotland. If that was implemented, given that how coal and gas supplies lie in central Scotland, it would make it very difficult for this to go ahead in Scotland, because I think somebody did, I haven't got the slide, but somebody did a model of this, and it basically gave you about 2 sites where you could fit a well, that as long as the settlement meant a house and not just Glasgow and Edinburgh, there would be about 2 sites where you could squeeze in a well in those licensed areas, and that would be in places like the Pentlands, where the geology is probably less favourable anyway. So that's one aspect of it. Other things within the planning system, I guess, would be, well, there is currently a restriction on, if somebody does an activity on your land, they have to get your permission. Now, the UK government recently put through a bill called the Infrastructure Bill, now the Infrastructure Act, which tried to take away the right for people to object if their property was being drilled underneath of. At the last minute, I think it was pointed out to the UK government when this was going through the committee stage in Parliament that Scottish trespass laws are different from English trespass laws, and if the UK government wanted to change the trespass laws to allow this in Scotland, they'd have to undevolve trespass laws, which would be controversial to say the least, I think, given that they have signed up for the Smith Commission. So it would be going in entirely the opposite direction to where they said they were going. So they backed off of allowing horizontal drilling under houses or under people's property without their permission in Scotland. That would mean, say, if they were going to extract carbon methane or shale gas in central Scotland, somewhere like Cumbernauld, they would have to ask every householder above where they're drilling for permission to do that, which would be quite laborious and would slow things down. And if people said no, it could slow things down quite a lot. It might be less of a protection in areas like Dumfriesshire, where Buccleuch estates own pretty much the whole lot, and Buccleuch are quite keen on it. Then going on to the sort of environmental regulation, SEPA say they've got adequate powers to deal with this. They've got some powers which deal with some of it. They've got powers to prevent pollution of groundwater from comes from the Water Framework Directive, which is European legislation, which says that groundwater quality must not be allowed to get worse. The trouble is, SEPA don't know what groundwater quality is in a lot of places because they only have a limited number of boreholes. Groundwater boreholes are quite expensive to drill, and SEPA doesn't have a huge amount of money. So they tend to monitor groundwater in places where there's already boreholes, so that's places like industrial sites, farms that have wells, sort of some hospital sites have got their own water supplies. It's not a comprehensive network by any means. And I know down at Canonby, the nearest borehole to the sites that they were drilling was about 25 miles away, the other side of the M74 at Gretna. Nobody really seemed to be terribly sure which way the groundwater in that aquifer flowed and whether it would actually flow towards the monitoring site or not. And then once you look at that site, the things they routinely monitor at that site are mainly things like agricultural pesticides. They're not monitoring the sort of things that would potentially cause contamination from coal bed methane extraction. So they wouldn't know if there was pollution. A, it could take a long time to find out about it, and B, it would be hard for anyone to prove that it wasn't something that was there before the extraction happened. So a minimum before any extraction happens, there needs to be a baseline monitoring program at a site near to the extraction site to find out what contaminants there are that are relevant contaminants in the groundwater, so that if there is any change, it can be proved that it's due to the operators. Because in America, a lot of the operators are saying, well, it was there anyway, just nobody had looked for it. Yeah, people perhaps have always caught fire. And it's become hard to prove, and because there's no background monitoring, that they don't know. So there would need to be monitoring for at least, or should be monitoring for at least a couple of years to establish a baseline level of what's going on there. There's also pollution prevention and control regulations which cover industrial processes, which would cover things like emissions from flare stacks, but it wouldn't really cover leaks, well, it's unclear how it would cover leaks from failed boreholes, and how SEPA would deal with that. Health and Safety Executive are responsible for monitoring borehole construction and testing boreholes to check that they're not leaking and safe. I don't know how much experience they've actually got of testing gas boreholes. I suspect most of the boreholes they've had experience of might be groundwater boreholes rather than gas boreholes, because there's currently only, I think, two onshore gas sites. There's a couple down in Dorset that are conventional gas extraction sites, but they're not. The North Sea is monitored by a separate organisation, I think. So that's a different matter. Seabed activity. This is actually that's slide isn't quite correct. The Marine Scotland is responsible for monitoring activity on the seabed, so things like putting drilling rigs on the seabed would be Marine Scotland. Crown Estates own the seabed, and they have to issue leases to anyone that wants to do anything on the seabed, so Crown Estates would also have to approve anything that was going on the seabed. Crown Estates is currently a reserved organisation. It's run by the UK government, but there's a proposal to devolve that to Scotland, so that would make Scottish government responsible for licensing things that were going on to the seabed in the estuaries. Okay. Yeah, okay. I think this is the last one. Sorry, that was the last one anyway. Yeah, so I couldn't remember whether I got a closing slide or not. So that kind of shows what the regulatory setup is or isn't. And so, sorry if I've gone over time.
Very much, Jenna. I won't take questions yet. We'll have time for questions at the end, but I want to move on. A lot of information there about the environmental impact, and I'm now going to hand over to Professor Andrew Watterson, who is a public health specialist, and he's from Stirling University. He's director there of you can see it there, the Occupational and Environmental Health Research Group. And I'll hand directly over to Andrew. Got a
few aides here, so that's why I need the chair. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think it's a big issue. What I want to do is, first of all, have a look at the context in the sense of what public health does and how it plays into unconventional gas. Most of what I'm talking about relates to all of the areas that Janet talked about. Secondly, I want to have a look at some of the principles and tools that policymakers should consider, that communities should consider, and certainly politicians should consider as well. And thirdly, I want to have a look at the regulation and practice that operates, practice elsewhere, because at the moment there's no fracking in Scotland, although there is coal bed methane. And finally, have a look at the position in Scotland now, where we stand, and possibly look at some of the ways forward. Now, I come from a public health background, and there is something called a public health approach. And the public health approach is basically underpinned by prevention. And it's fascinating to see how the debates at the moment are being presented, because prevention initially is this hazardous and should we be doing it? And if it's hazardous and you don't know the risks, and there's data showing that there could be a problem, and there are gaps in the data that don't allow you to properly assess it, then you usually go for prevention. That's the precautionary principle. And what drives a lot of public health is precaution. So the first question about unconventional gas is it safe? Is it healthy for the various parties involved? And if it's too unsafe and it's too unhealthy, you don't do it. The second question then is, if you think it's relatively safe and healthy, then you look at regulating it. And in Scotland, we're already, in some respects, at stage 2. Because regulators deal with controlling things, regulators don't deal with banning things usually. So bear that in mind. The underpinning principle is this precautionary approach. And you do need to bear in mind too that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Janet was referring to this, where we don't know what's going on. That's not a reason for doing it. It's a reason for finding out what the consequences could be and then acting. And if the industry doesn't provide us with the information and says, as Janet quite rightly said, we don't know about this, we've not looked at health information, then you in fact do have quite a big problem there. So consider that. And I've got with me a crew that I always bring with me. Top left there, you've actually got the burn grade shale oil miners in West Calder, not a million miles away from here, in 1937. So dealing with shale oil has been an activity for a long, long time, and you can see they're well kitted up. Now, they were concerned with getting the shale oil out and turning it into paraffin. And there were lots of hazards with that. This is something to consider in terms of how quickly we find out what problems will be. And those workers, not those individual ones, from the 1850s around this area were extracting shale oil. 1870s, the first occupational diseases came out for those workers. And would you believe, almost 50 years later, they were still reporting those workers getting occupational diseases. Now, a lot of people regard workers as the guinea pigs to tell us something about what might happen to the communities. So if you're looking at identifying problems, an obvious health hazard, a major health hazard that you and I would be able to identify was occurring in those shale paraffin workers and wasn't being picked up. Now, what happens now is people say, well, in those days you had to wear all this gear and you were exposed to horrible things at very high levels. And that's true. But another principle of public health is that you may get a small population exposed to very high levels of something, like the shale oil miners, or you might get a very large population exposed to much lower levels of something that could in fact be highly hazardous. That's the big public health problem. And we heard in the clip at the beginning, in terms of the film, about some of these very low-level problems. Now we're into the age of nanotoxicology, which is looking at minute particles of things that may have adverse health effects. And we used to measure things in parts per million. Then it went to parts per billion. Now we're talking about parts per trillion having an adverse effect on people, having an adverse effect on children and so on. So when they say, oh, there's only a little exposure, it's very low, it's not a problem, that's not the question you want answered. The question you want answered is, what effect will it have on me? So, sorry, so on that picture on the bottom right, you see, you know, supposedly a fracking well that will have minimal exposures. And then on the left, you see what the fracking workers are engaged in, and then you see the sort of volume and the number of wells that may occur, and the problem changes. Next. So I would urge communities like yourselves and the policymakers and the politicians to consider some key principles when you're dealing with unconventional gas extraction. And I've put up here, not a revolutionary organisation, World Health Organization, 25 years ago, established key principles with regard to environment and health. And these are the principles that should underpin any decision making. Firstly, they said that information and consultation on the state of the environment, plans and decisions should be made available to individuals. This goes back to what a regulator in Canada called the right to know, the right to be involved, and the right to participate. And simply being told information, as we have been about those shale oil miners in West Lothian, didn't do a damn thing. You can have all the information you want, but unless you're engaged in decision making, there'll be a real problem. The second principle that they picked out, and again bear in mind we're talking about very low level exposures, is the health of every individual, especially those in vulnerable and high risk groups, should be protected. So we know there are problems for adults with very low level exposures, but in fact there are additional problems for the very young, the very old, the ill, and for pregnant women. Those are vulnerable high-risk groups. So in assessing the impact of fracking, you want to know what these low-level exposures will do in terms of hitting those groups. And the health of individuals and communities should take clear precedence over the economy and trade. That doesn't mean you ignore the economy and trade and jobs, but the priority should be for the health bodies to protect the health of the individuals and the communities. The strategic elements are about using low-impact technology, which we might come back to in our discussions, and having high standards of management and regulations. Next slide, please. So the sorts of tools that you now see being employed with regard to unconventional gas extraction aren't health impact assessments, and health impact assessments are about looking in detail at what the consequences of a development would be, what the risks are, and what the benefits are, and then looking at the things around that. So it would be looking at employment, it would be looking at the physical environment, it would also be looking at things like well-being. And it wouldn't just be assessing what goes down the well, it would be all the steps before and all the steps afterwards to look at the public health consequences. So that's, you know, looking at the lorries that come in, the lorries that go out, the disposal, the winding up of the wells, and how secure they are. Again, things that Janet referred to. So what you would hope to see is a good health impact assessment, but that's actually allowing you to do the job and then say, well, you know, we'll reduce the adverse effects. So I've got an example here. I was involved in the Dart inquiry in Falkirk, which was coal bed methane. No health impact assessment was required. This is the statement, the environmental statement, and you probably get an idea of how thick it is, from the company and the consultant who worked for them. And in there they said there could be a few health problems, like noise and like dust. There could be a bit of a problem with diesel, but otherwise crack on with it. It's not a problem. So that effectively was what they were offering as health impacts. Everything is fine. What I have here is a small town in Colorado. It's several hundred pages thick. It is full of detailed assessments of air pollution, water pollution, the effects on the community in terms of insecurity with regard to jobs, with regard to housing, the worries about planning. So that's the mental health well-being side of things. So they did a detailed independent assessment. They weren't paid by the company, as happens with Dart and other companies here. That's what we should be looking for here. And we've got this reference from the Minister to a full public health impact assessment, and I'll come back to that, because a full public health impact assessment is a lot more than this. But that's what you should be looking for. Okay. So there's the things, the health profile of the population. Now, just because companies don't look at what was there before, lets them off the hook. So you need to have baseline data about what might be going on in that population. And it's very odd how many of these unconventional gas extraction developments are in areas where there is already significant pollution. So there are vulnerable populations there already. And we do know something about the acute effects. We know something about air, soil and water pollution that I'll touch on. We know something about traffic. But the other things that seem to be dropped off of these impact assessments are community wellness and mental health. In other words, do you want to live in the middle of a frack field? They are the ones about economic and employment assessment, which isn't just jobs created, but for how long, and it's also jobs lost, because that's all about the public health of the community. And the sort of economic and the general economic setting. Does it change the socio-economic structure of the place? If you suddenly have loads of wells, and what's the health infrastructure for looking after the population? So that's what you should be after. Now this is this person may be well known to some of you. He's a Greek bed and breakfast owner, and he's from Greek mythology, Procrustes, and he ran a bed and breakfast establishment. And what he did was invite guests to stay, and he had one bed. And what would happen was, if they were very tall, he would lop off their legs and arms so they fitted in. And if they were very small, he would actually stretch the people so they fitted in. So according to Procrustes, you can always get somebody in the bed. You can always fit the particular activity to whatever you want. Bear in mind that Procrustean approach when we look at what's going on in Scotland and indeed in England. Because we've been told that there have been very substantial reviews of the public health impacts of unconventional gas extraction. And those reviews came from Public Health England, following on from the government saying we want fracking. That's the Westminster government, I hasten to add, not the Scottish government. And you need rose-tinted spectacles here, I think, to look at this. Because what they said was, this industry is absolutely fine as long as it's well regulated and industry carries out good practice. We don't have anything like Public Health England. We have the equivalent here, Health Protection Scotland. Health Protection Scotland then said, well, we don't have the resources to do the sort of work to assess public health impacts here, so we'll use the Public Health England impact, 2013. So we're told that's absolutely fine. And the Scottish Scientific Review said that as well, the review panel. And on the right-hand side, you'll see what Public Health England itself said. Bear in mind this Procrustean approach. If things don't fit in, we'll lop it off, but we'll just forget it. There was nothing on wider public health impacts in that document. They said that themselves. There was nothing on global climate change, which can also have major public health impacts. There was nothing on the socio-economic effects, changing communities by bringing in unconventional gas extraction. And there was nothing at all on work environments. So they admitted that themselves. They said, here are all the emissions, but don't worry, carry on. Then in the British Medical Journal, highly respected, they had an editorial. And in the British Medical Journal, they said that this Public Health England report is a leap of faith, unsubstantiated by scientific evidence. And we hear a lot about evidence base. And of course what you want is research that provides the evidence base for the decision. But what we got in England was policy-based evidence gathering. In other words, the government had a view, the minister had a view, the public health body then reflected that view, and everything was fine. So these commentators in the British Medical Journal said that the claims of the Public Health England report that everything was fine didn't stack up. And they said they didn't think that the UK would be exempt from the problems that have emerged in the US. There may be differences in regulatory approach, there may be differences in geology, but they didn't think that they were substantial enough. And it said that the conclusions that shale gas presents a low public health risk is not substantiated by the literature. It ignores the inherent industry risks, whatever regulation applies. And again, we've heard from Janet about some of these things: casing failures, cement failures, wastewater spillage, which all affects the air pollution and the water pollution that might occur. And it also ignored the fact, again, that we've heard alluded to, that unlike a lot of US states, in Scotland and indeed in England, the developments will occur in heavily populated areas. Next. So if you think about the regulation that we've got, the setup is that it isn't evidence-based. That's what the specialists say, the scientists say. The UK government has been driven by trying to get rid of red tape, free up markets, which will benefit, of course, the companies, but not the communities. And that's sort of cloaked in this better regulation agenda. So you reduce the controls, you remove the controls, and you let industry rip. And I think the worry now that we have is that when we see the studies of wells and the regulation that's gone on in England, there have been major problems with that. There could be a whole series of potentially serious public health threats. The assurance that we're given in Scotland is that the Scottish Scientific Panel was the appropriate body to say everything is fine. So after Health Protection Scotland said things were fine, the Scottish Scientific Panel said they were. Bear in mind the Procrustean approach. So was that full of public health people? Well, no. There was no public health person on that panel. They were geologists and engineers. And some of the geologists, in fact, have got links with the underground coal gasification industry. No public health expert, no health expert, no independent expert on regulation, which is what they were pinning so much on, and no independent experts on industry environmental performance. So a lot of problems there, I think. I thought you'd already know. Okay, so the sort of arguments that are coming out are that you don't have to worry, this has already been checked elsewhere. Now, we don't have fracking in Scotland at the moment, so it's the Department of Energy and Climate Change in England that has been looking at this agenda. And what they have been saying seems to be being picked up north of the border. And what they were saying is, well, we've assessed all the chemicals, but we can't tell you in detail because we've got to do it on a case-by-case basis for each well. They said, we will give you full details of the information about the chemicals, unlike the US. But when you look at it, what comes out is that, in fact, that is protected by commercial sensitivity. So where's the openness? Where's the transparency? You know, where is the informed consent from communities and from individuals about potential threats to their health? And then we've heard about all of the chemicals that might be used in terms of hydraulic fracking. And Quadrilla seemed to be, right, the drilling company, headed up by the former, at one stage, headed up by the former head of BP. Quadrilla is the source of information for the Department of Energy down in Westminster. And what they say there is that Quadrilla only uses a very small number of chemicals, and these are perfectly safe. One of them, in fact, is used in cosmetics and facial cream, and the other you'll come across in your swimming pool. And in a small number of cases, there may be some biocides there. DEC cites Quadrilla as the definitive source of low risk. The Advertising Standards Agency looked at the Quadrilla statement recently, and it came out with a judgment in 2013-14, and it says the claim that Quadrilla's fracturing fluid doesn't contain hazardous or toxic components should have been qualified. Because it was not, we conclude that it gave a misleading impression of the materials used. So the government uses its industry information, which is, to put it politely, misleading. They also said that Quadrilla had given the impression that claims were universally accepted, which we consider was not the case, and these claims were that hydraulic fracturing doesn't lead to contamination of the underground aquifer, and there is no evidence of aquifer contamination from hydraulic fracturing. The Advertising Standards Agency said that was misleading. So the information we're getting is industry-based and, as I say, to put it politely, is misleading. And I won't go into detail on this one, but there's a quick example. If you recall, they said it's used in cosmetics and lipstick, one of these chemicals. Some researchers in the US looked at this, couldn't find that it was being used in cosmetics or chemicals, but we'll assume that it can be. And when they started to look at the chemical, they found out it could have all sorts of neurological effects, that it could break down and produce something that was far more dangerous. And in fact, that was, although this was potentially hazardous, they picked out the least hazardous substance that they were using. They could have picked out others. Next slide, please. So just one very quick example of a particular chemical that's already been touched on that could be involved in unconventional gas extraction, because I think it illustrates the point nicely. And this is benzene. And the oil industry in the US in 1948 said benzene is a carcinogen, it causes leukemia, and we don't believe that there's any safe concentration. So you've got a problem with that. Immediately after that, the oil industry then constantly denied what it had said and tried to discredit the various studies that had been done. So this is the sort of doubt is their product argument. Industry produced doubt about research, which indicates public health risks. Oops, next slide. Okay. So, just working through benzene. The Health and Safety Executive, which controls the start of the process and therefore will have some control over what happens down the line, said that in fact there wasn't a problem with benzene at 10 parts per million. If you recall at the beginning I was talking about hazardous substances affecting you in parts per trillion. And every time you look at what the UK regulator was doing, it had poorer, weaker, worse standards than in the US. And then what happened was a whole series of research papers came out in respected journals, and they suddenly discovered that you couldn't work out what low-level effects were from high-level effects. In other words, there could be significant effects at low levels, and that the risks were being underestimated. Then, more significantly, if you're thinking about vulnerable populations, they said that benzene crosses the human placenta and is found in human breast milk, and that children and infants may be more susceptible to the substance. So those are big issues in terms of vulnerable populations that you take account of in terms of a public health impact assessment. They then went on and found that there was even a problem with parental exposure hitting the unborn child. So that appeared in respectable journals, and there we have the standard at the bottom, 0.1 parts per million being a problem in the workplace, and there being worse problems beyond. Janet's referred to biocides. I won't go into detail on that, but researchers in the last six months have produced work on the biocides that are being used. These are the antibacterials. And in Colorado, which is one of the better states, they found that there had been 595 spills in the year of their study in 2013. And then when they looked at these substances, polyacrylamide was one of them, acrylamide was one of them, they found that a lot of these substances could be hazardous. Some of them were okay before you put them down the pipe, but changed into something else. And a lot of them interacted. And there was a lot that they didn't know about them. So here we had significant potential problems and data gaps. And that's significant in terms of the sort of throughput there is of water and additives. And that's just an example from SEPA about what you may get in the water that Janet has touched on. I won't go into detail on that, but you can see there they're talking about additives, 0.7%. There's some debate about those figures, but if we accept the official figures, say that there's 2 million gallons of water go down one well, and you could get 8 wells sunk on a site, and it could be up to 8 million gallons of water used. But if we take the lowest figure, 2 million gallons of water down a well, in terms of the additives in it, you're talking about 1,000 gallons being used. So we're talking here about figures, if the exposures could have an effect of parts per trillion, that could be very significant in public health terms. Okay, John Robertson isn't here, but I think he's made the point about how the media cover things. And in fact, if you ignore the media, because they're not a reliable source, I think he might well say that as well. If you just look at reviews of papers, scientific papers, in peer-reviewed journals, right, and you look at the direction of travel, which is what scientists do, are things being replicated, are the same concerns popping up? What you see on that picture are details about health in the middle, that first round circle, and then water on the right top, and then air quality on the right bottom. And the blue is papers that show adverse or potential adverse health ill effects from unconventional gas, and the red is the one that shows things are safe. So if you look at that, the vast majority of papers coming out now are indicating that there are problems with unconventional gas extraction liquid. I'm moving towards the end now. So if we have a look at what's the state of play in Scotland, down one more, down one more, down one more, whoops, go up one. Okay, if we look at what's the position, have we got the evidence that in fact tells us there's not a problem? So if we're looking at good health impact assessments from the NHS, which would be an independent body, good health impact assessments of unconventional gas in Scotland, none. Next, just down one. Number of Scottish Government departments that have conducted independent public health impact assessments, one may be coming, but at the moment it's none. You may see a pattern emerging here. Number of proper baseline public health studies in Scottish areas where unconventional gas may be developed, none. Number of full unconventional gas public health impact assessments across the UK, none. So there's an absence of evidence there that doesn't give us security that there isn't a problem. On the other side of the coin, down one, we've got the 750 chemicals that may be associated with unconventional gas extraction. The number of those that have been publicly disclosed in full, because of course fracking doesn't occur yet, is we don't know. I've asked the HSE and they say, oh yeah, we get the details of the chemical, but because it's commercially confident, we can't, commercially confidential, we can't pass them on to you. But we do have some assessments, next one, of some of the chemicals, and 353 of these chemicals have been assessed, right? So there's 350 odd that we don't know anything about. And of those 350, 25% were known to cause cancer and mutations in cells. Next one. Something like 37% were known to be endocrine disruptors. That is, they could interfere with development and the male and female reproductive system. So there could be reproductive adverse effects, but also things like cancer and so on. Next one, we're down to the level of EDCs on there. Yeah. If we look at these endocrine disruptors then, going back to where I started at the beginning, respected researchers in the US have found that these chemicals can have an adverse effect at a part per trillion. So that's the equivalent of a teaspoon in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So again, if industry says, don't worry, you know, the effects are incredibly low, there's only a little bit, what does that mean? That's what you want to know. And as ever, the Nordic countries are way ahead, and they've looked across Europe at all endocrine disruptors, not just one from the unconventional gas industry, but they've looked across Europe, and they found, for instance, that up to 40% of the health costs associated with serious male reproductive problems are due to endocrine disruptors. And that's costing Europe something like 1,200 million euros. So there's an economic cost to this, as well as a human cost. If we looked at the number of chemicals worldwide for which we've got detailed risk assessments, it's about 25% or under. Next one, if we look at the number of new field and lab regulatory staff available to monitor unconventional gas with regard to environment, work and fire, we don't have any details, and fair enough, you know, the regulators say it's not here yet. And if we look at the number of comprehensive public health laws and regulations in either the United Kingdom or specifically in Scotland, we don't have any figures. So, if we look at what the industry consultants say about this. They say that anti-fracking groups, communities, are so effective because what they do is focus on knowledge gaps, regulatory deficiencies, poor local regulation and enforcement, and they emphasise the precautionary principle. Well, I work in public health, and a lot of public health professionals would say those are exactly the things that we all focus on. And that's why there is so much concern about the industry. So we have now the situation in Scotland where we've got a very welcome moratorium brought in by the Scottish Government, but it begs lots of questions. So if you're looking at the right to be, the right to know, the right to be involved and the right to act, what exactly will full public consultation be? If we've got going to have a full public health impact assessment, will it be along the lines of the ones that I've suggested, or will it be something else? Also, we're told that they're going to strengthen planning and that they're going to tighten regulation. There's something odd about this. There's something very good about the moratorium, but there's something odd about this, because beforehand, across the UK, everybody was saying, well, everything's regulated. We've got all the planning controls we need. We understand the health impacts. Well, if that's the case, why do we have these problems now? Why are they trying to tighten these things? Clearly something had gone wrong. So to finish, I just want to draw your attention to two big reports that probably should be the baseline for the decisions that we take in Scotland. One is from New York State, and this is the one on the left, and the other is from the American Public Health Association. These aren't campaigning groups. They are mainstream medical and scientific groups. And the one on the left, New York State, they said, we don't fully understand the risks of unconventional gas extraction. The public health impacts could be very broad in terms of air and water pollution. The weight of evidence shows that there's significant uncertainty involved as well about what adverse health outcomes there might be. So their conclusion was that fracking is highly likely to have a negative impact from a health point of view with regard to air quality, worker health, impact on healthcare infrastructure, the demands that are placed on it, and the social determinants of health. And that decision, along with community pressure and public opinion, led to New York State Governor saying, we're not going to have fracking in our state at the moment. So it was evidence-based. 4,500 hours of effort went into preparing that report. It used 20 research scientists, and if we're looking at the public health impact assessment from Scotland that's been planned, to get the equivalent of that, you're probably talking about something like 100 weeks of work of an individual. To produce that report, that's what we'd be looking for. On the right-hand side, we've got the American Public Health Association report, and that's saying we should apply the precautionary principle in this field. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it doesn't look as if unconventional gas will in fact solve climate change and therefore will lead to public health impacts. That fracking poses potential risks to public health and raises concerns about water pollution, air pollution, worker exposure and so on. That vulnerable populations, particularly children and low-income rural populations, are most at risk. That large quantities of chemicals will be used, and for them in the wells, they've got the estimates of those additives that are innocuous in a well life, totting up to 100,000 gallons of chemical additives. That there are research gaps, and the key at the end, they say an increasing number of case reports, agency documents, scientific papers and environmental models indicate that the process presents unique and significant health concerns. And that's why the elephant's there. Do we want to step off this cliff with those sorts of risks? You know, what will the implications be?
Thank you very much, Andrew. I was thinking it's unfortunate that Fergus Ewing isn't here with us, because we've made a good start at both the environmental and the public health risk assessment, and it's not looking good for the fracking industry. The final speaker, before we open up for questions, I'm going to ask Colin Beattie, who's the locally elected representative in the Scottish Parliament, the MSP. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Wow, it's quite a subject, isn't it? And we've just heard a lot of the technical support for anti-fracking. But you know, like an awful lot of people, when I first read about this process, it seemed like an innovative way to extract gas and to provide cheap energy. And I thought that would benefit everybody. But as I read more about the consequences of the fracking process, I began to become concerned. So much so that I got one of my parliamentary researchers to investigate and to prepare a paper for me on the fracking. Now that paper was an eye-opener. The consequences of the fracking process, at first I thought the guy was simply anti-fracking and that the research was skewed somehow, but it quickly became apparent that this wasn't the case and that there was a real cause for concern. And later I'll discuss some of the other forms of energy extraction over which I do have concerns. Now, admittedly, there were some apocryphal stories that, when investigated, proved to be exaggerated and sometimes untrue, but there was plenty and more to give me real concerns. Now, at that time, the Scottish Government was still ambivalent on the merits of fracking and was working its way to a conclusion as to its position. And I felt, personally, that my responsibility as a constituency MSP was to the people of Midlothian. There was no doubt in my mind that fracking was a real danger to the environment, and that the quality of life of the people I represented should be protected. And I had no hesitation in publicly opposing fracking, regardless of any decision that the Scottish Government might have made. And it was my intention to continue to oppose fracking in Midlothian, because that was my job. But why do I oppose fracking? I mean, quite simply, and I'm focusing on Midlothian here, although you know, I also cover Musselburgh and that area as well, which is also a coal mining area. But Midlothian is a former deep coal mining area. And for centuries, the monks and then the landowners and then the state have burrowed and mined under us. Does it really seem smart to effectively set off explosions underground, which I'm told, in certain cases, can amount to 3 on the Richter scale? I mean, I think not. Many of these workings are fragile and full of water, and the last thing we want to do is disturb the balance which has hopefully mostly been achieved. Now later on I'd like to explore what can effectively be done with these old mine workings, but first I want to examine the state of the fracking industry in 2015. Fracking, as we know it, has a history that dates back to the 1940s, and although it was only as recently as 2003 that technology was utilised on a massive scale, and that year saw the Halliburton Corporation developed the technology to make deep horizontal shale drilling possible. The situation in the US was helped, or in reality made worse, the following year when the Federal Environmental Protection Agency claimed in a study that fracking posed no threat to underground water supplies. Subsequently, the Bush administration exempted fracking from the Safe Water Drinking Act in 2005's Energy Policy Act. So the gateway to a new boom industry was opened without anyone truly understanding the risks involved. The American charity Rights of Nature recently did a study of fracking, and some of their facts and conclusions are really eye-opening. For example, the study estimates that the US nationally uses 400 billion gallons of frac fluid, comprising up to 600 chemicals. Now, these chemicals include toxic additives such as kerosene and formaldehyde, and we've seen that in detail from the previous 2 speakers. On average, 330 tons of chemicals are used for each fracking operation, and 2/3 of the toxic chemicals remain underground. And to add to this, the toxic wastewater produced in each operation can't be processed by wastewater treatment. Instead, the toxic water is dumped into open-air pits. Colorado, which has over 51,000 fracking wells, so many of these toxic water dumps washed away during the floods the state suffered a couple of years ago. If we expect climate change to provide more extreme weather, we can expect more of this toxic sludge to end up in our environment if fracking continues. There are other major effects to our landscape. A study published last month linked no fewer than 77 earthquakes in Poland Township, Ohio, in March 2014 to fracking. In one case, 5 earthquakes were directly linked to the activation of a previously unknown fault by hydraulic fracturing. These quakes ranged in magnitude from 2.1 to 3 on the Richter scale, occurring within almost half a mile of a group of oil and gas wells that were conducting fracking at the same time. Now, the authors of the study claimed that the magnitude 3 earthquakes were in fact one of the largest earthquakes ever induced by hydraulic fracturing in the United States. But let me make the point that Poland Township had never recorded any seismic activity prior to fracking, and yet now we see fracking induce an earthquake of this size. Fracking has also been linked to the contamination of tap water in some US states. Dimmock, a northeastern Pennsylvania township, saw several high-profile cases of water contamination, resulting in a $4.1 million settlement against Cabot Oil and Gas. After local residents had noticed their water turning cloudy and bubbly, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection investigated and discovered that Cabot's poorly built well casings, the pipe that lines a well as it passes through aquifers close at the surface, had allowed stray methane to leak into more than a dozen wells. And while methane is non-toxic in water, it can still be dangerous, and in one instance in Dimmock, a resident's backyard well exploded due to the gas build-up in the water. Now, these kinds of stories are not exclusive to America. In Australia, which has also seen its own fracking boom, the effects on local people have been devastating in some circumstances. In one instance, a local bull stud farmer was threatened with legal action to allow gas companies to build on his land, only to find that after he agreed for one well to be built, nothing happened, leaving his land and his future in doubt. And there are many other cases of oil companies bullying their way onto farmers' land and then abandoning ship when they lose interest. In one case, the farmer and her family had to stay indoors for 3 days while the gas company sorted out a gas migration issue on their land. And I can't imagine this filled the farmer with much confidence that fracking would go smoothly. Never mind the inconvenience of being unable to leave their house for several days. The situation in Europe is proving to be slightly more resilient. Earlier this week it was reported that US energy giant Chevron was terminating its fracking operations in Romania due to poor exploration results. And that effectively spells the end of Chevron's shale gas exploration in Europe, following recent announcements that it was halting projects in Poland and terminating shale gas agreements in Lithuania and Ukraine. In fact, Chevron's 2014 global failure rate is almost double that of the rate in 2013, with 16 of the 53 wells drilled last year found to have no commercially viable quantities of oil or natural gas. Other parts of Europe, such as Germany and France, have already imposed a moratorium on fracking. There's other encouraging signs in the States. Since last October, the number of active oil rigs has dropped from 1,606 to 1,019, a drop of 37% in only 19 weeks. Now, while there are only 289 active natural gas rigs, it's the lowest number since 1993. Now, part of this is due to the cost of fracking. The price of oil has decreased sharply in recent months, and this is clearly having a knock-on effect to companies involved in the fracking industry. At the start of this month, the price of oil was roughly $44 a barrel. It has improved a bit since then. Hydraulic fracking companies needed to fetch a price of between $55 and $100 a barrel to break even. And many energy companies are now realising there's no longer the value in developing or operating their fracking sites. Meanwhile, New York's governor recently announced a ban on fracking, resulting in some towns considering succeeding to the more frack-friendly Pennsylvania. Now, I've not mentioned underground coal gasification, a technique that I have major concerns over. This involves producing gas from coal seams that are deep underground and can't be mined with conventional mining techniques. In our area, this would largely mean developing UCG under the seabed of the Firth of Forth. Underground coal gasification has been described by experts as being extremely experimental and a lot more risky than conventional gas techniques. And considering what we've just been discussing regarding shale gas, there's no doubt in my mind that we should absolutely not allow UCG. The irreparable damage that we will risk is in no way a price worth paying. But there are some other forms of energy that are worth investigating. Geothermal energy is a relatively new source. It's an old source, but it's new for us, that I believe can be used for small to medium scale projects here in Midlothian. And this project involves taking water that's naturally warmer than on the surface and using it to generate heat in nearby buildings. And we can benefit from this as the old mine workings are perfect for providing access to that warmer water. Too often we see our flooded mine shafts as being a liability. We now have the opportunity to make them an asset and a source of clean energy. Successful initiatives based on this process have already been carried out in the Netherlands, and I sit in a government geothermal working group that is presently examining how to take this forward across Scotland. I look forward hopefully to seeing some new geothermal ventures in places such as Midlothian. Incidentally, it's also possible to use geothermal energy to produce air conditioning for commercial and domestic premises, but I have a feeling this may not be a priority in Scotland. There are different methods for extracting geothermal energy, and I've only described the obvious type for Midlothian given our history. Here in Scotland, the Scottish Government recently announced its own moratorium in granting consents for fracking while further research is carried out, and it's intended that several steps which have already been described to you will be carried out as part of the process of visiting this. Of course, there are limits in this moratorium. It's based on planning consents only, and due to the limited extent of Scotland's devolved powers, the moratorium covers land only, not offshore developments. Therefore, underground coal gasification is pretty much excluded. At present, the Government's understanding of devolved powers is that we don't have the locus to prevent UCG in seawater, but our hands are tied until such time as Westminster moves on this and perhaps devolves this to the Scottish Government, and we would then be able to extend the moratorium to seawater. However, it's pretty clear to me that the Government's taken the most sensible steps available to it, and I have taken the opportunity to meet the Energy Minister on more than one occasion to raise the concerns that I have and my constituents have in connection with unconventional gas extraction. And I hope these meetings had some bearing on the present outcome. The evidence we see is quite clear and substantially stacked against fracking, and until such time as we know it's safe for our landscape and our people, there are absolutely no good reasons for fracking to be carried out in Scotland, let alone elsewhere. And can I just close by urging you not to assume that this threat has gone away just because there's a moratorium. There are powerful forces out there, including the Westminster Government, who want this to happen. Do not underestimate their ability and their willingness to resort to any tactics to make this happen. Only sustained and united opposition by us all will ensure that this country remains frack-free. Stay strong, stay involved, stay active. We can and will win this battle to protect our environment and protect our people from this dangerous development. People power does work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. I'm going to ask the speakers to come to the front, if you may. We've got a short time for questions. What I want to do is to ask to take a series of questions all together, because time is a bit short. If you've got a question for one particular speaker, please say that. Otherwise, I'll be asking all three speakers to sum up at the end and answer the questions that you've got. So can I see if there's any hands? Yeah, over there, please. And I think there's a roving mic.
Yeah, one issue which I have about fracking and about UCG as well, which really hasn't been touched on at all, or very little, by the speakers so far, and that's the impact on climate change. All of these techniques involve, in some form or another, releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. And you know, I worry about a situation where, for example, with the current Scottish Government moratorium, we've seen in a lot of the previous studies in the context of regulation, if you can get a study to give you an all clear for local environmental impacts, then that activity will be regulated. And that's what I fear about the Scottish Government's moratorium, because it doesn't, as far as I'm aware, concern itself with the impact on climate change.
Okay, thank you. Can I see any other hands? Yep.
This may seem a relatively small point, but Janet, you mentioned the NASA discovery of a methane cloud above some of the areas in the US. While one might speculate this could be replicated here, can you tell me if you'd established, or NASA indeed had established, what the implications of that methane cloud be, because as I understand it, methane is actually heavier than air at 1,000 millibars, and it's likely to settle. And, you know, methane is, in an oxygen environment, is one of the most, you know, inflammable gases available. So, to say nothing of its toxicity. If you may not have any more information, in which case I'll try and follow it up somewhere through the net, but that was my question.
Okay, thank you. Can I see any other hands? Yeah.
It's not so much a question, it's really just a comment that you often you mentioned cancer in children and the unborn are most at risk of cancer. And I just feel it's very much needs to be emphasised that children's cancer is quite different from adult cancers, because the children are children treated for cancer. Is this a bit blurrier? Children treated for cancer, the treatments themselves can cause very long-term effects on the children, and they will need. It's quite different from the adults because the children are growing up and they're rapid turnover cells, and so the children are at risk can be at risk all through their life and need follow-up throughout their life. Really, so the cost to the NHS is quite big, because this is a group that can be can face some of the worst health consequences of any patient group.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one more question, or two if it's a short one. Any hands up for the last? No, well, I'm not seeing a hand, so I'm going to hand it over to the speakers. Okay, so your question on climate change, one on methane cloud, and one on cancer children. And Andrew's keen to speak.
I'll just answer the one on climate change.
There's a microphone.
Yeah, the American Public Health Association, in its health impact assessment, specifically talked about that issue, and it said that if we went in a big way, or they went in a big way for unconventional gas, it would only cut the carbon emissions by about 20%. In other words, it wasn't an answer to global climate change, and they flagged up the public health issues. And what goes round comes round. What goes up comes down. So we're not going to escape that in Scotland. I think it's a very good point.
Okay. Yeah, just I'll sort of try and cover it in order. The climate change, yeah, I mean, I totally agree, both from burning fossil fuels and from methane leakage. Continuous reliance on fossil fuels is a huge climate risk. Climate Change Scotland Act has got ambitious targets, our world-leading climate change targets, and rightly so. There is a clause in the Climate Change Scotland Act that talks about the duties of public bodies in relation to helping Scottish Government to meet its climate change targets. It's never actually been used in relation to the planning process, but there's no reason why it couldn't be. I think it's something that when the climate change bill was being drafted, people thought, anticipated that it could be. So it means that, public bodies, if they're buying a new central heating boiler for a public organisation, they have to think about the emissions aspects of that. But it also applies to, it specifically states, in carrying out their duties. So that means SEPA and the planning authorities have to take that into account when carrying out their duties. Now, there's been this argument that it's better to burn gas than to burn coal because the emissions per unit of carbon burnt are lower for gas than for coal, but that doesn't take into account the emissions from leaked methane. And as I said, methane is 25 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and we know there is a risk even from conventional gas fields of methane leakage from pipelines, etc., without looking at leaks from well casings. So yeah, I think absolutely that this, if ever anyone is going to find a case to test that clause of the Climate Change Scotland Act, it could be this, if this is forced to go ahead against, I think a lot of people's better judgment. Going back to the methane cloud that we talked about in America. Methane has an atomic weight of 16, so it's actually lighter than nitrogen and oxygen. But I think the main risk from this is the climate change risk. It's not a terribly toxic gas. Potentially some other gases that could leak out of wells, such as the hydrogen sulfide, which is certainly linked to Towns gas, is acutely toxic at ppm levels. Methane's not particularly toxic, unless you fill an area with it to the extent that you suffocate. But I think that the main risk of methane clouds is the climate risk from them. I think that's what I'd be most concerned about.
I think the gentleman made a good point about climate change, and I think in relation to the Scottish Government's moratorium, I don't think they mentioned anything specific about climate change in that. So what I'd like to do is take away from here, I'll actually speak to the Minister and make sure that there is something in there about climate change, because it's a very important point. And in relation to fracking, I suppose we've always focused on the environmental issues and the environmental dangers, which may be interpreted partly as climate change issues as well. But I think we need to specifically look at that in relation to the unconventional gas extraction in general. I can't believe that it's beneficial to the climate. It's not beneficial to the environment. It ain't going to be beneficial to the climate either. Methane, but I'll take that away back to the Minister. Methane cloud, everything I've heard about methane is that it eats away at the ozone layer. So any methane getting into the air can't be exactly what we're looking for. And it's just another reason why this form of, why fracking and unconventional gas extraction really is not the road we want to go down. The lady brought up a question of cancer, risk of cancer. Obviously the two other speakers here explored in detail the health issues that are around fracking, and mention was made of cancer, mention was made of various other ailments that arise from this process. Again, yet another good reason why we need to ban fracking completely. I think that the public health side has been highlighted now as perhaps having to come to the fore. I think that's recognised by the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government has included in the process it's going to go through now a public health consultation, and I think it's just a question of making sure that we get the right people there to give the proper analysis so we can get a proper public hearing on that.
Okay, I'm going to have to draw the meeting to a close. We've been given a tremendous amount of information, and thank our speakers very much for that. If you're still looking for more information, there's more information at the back, and I think there's certainly somebody there with a bucket as well to collect donations to help pay for the event. I mentioned earlier, and various people have mentioned, that we've won a small victory by people power, by communities coming together with environmentalists, with public health experts, with politicians that listen to what their constituents say. And it's a first step. We need to keep going. We need to get a complete ban on underground coal gasification. We need to get the offshore coal gasification included in that ban. And we need to keep pushing until we get that. The only people who seem to want underground unconventional gas extraction are the people who stand to make money out of it, and not the people who stand to lose from it. So let's keep pushing. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm sure I'll see you all again.